Ukraine has launched an effective counter-offensive against Russia in the last few weeks, winning thousands of square miles back from Putin's army. So what exactly is happening on the front line? I'm joined now by Spectator contributor Owen Matthews, who writes in this week's magazine about the ultra-right-wing nationalists who would be likely to take over from Putin if he were removed from power, and Mike Martin, a former British Army soldier and the author of Why We Fight. So Owen Matthews and Mike Martin, thank you for coming on to Spectator TV. Now, Mike, tell us about the latest in the Russian invasion of Ukraine, because it does sound like Ukraine's fighting back and quite effectively over the last week or so.
Yeah, thanks, Cindy. It's actually a really significant moment. So over the last 5 or 6 days or so, the Ukrainians have taken about 9,000 square kilometers of territory, liberated, I should say, from the Russian occupying forces. And in that area of the country, in Kharkiv in the northeast, they've pushed the Russians right back to the border. And quite significantly, they've captured a couple of major logistics hubs and logistics routes that supply the Russian forces in not just in that northeastern part of the country, but also in the Donbass in the east, where we had all those big battles a couple of months ago. So this is a huge setback for the Russian forces, both militarily, but I think perhaps more importantly psychologically, because it's really created some ripples both within the military and also within Moscow.
And how have they managed to do this? Because it has been 6 months in the war so far.
They're just better than the Russians. Over the last couple of months, they've been building up and signaling that they're going to be launching this big offensive in the south in Kherson. And that's a really important area that the Ukrainians need to take back, because it's on the way to Crimea. And Crimea is the most important part of Ukraine for Russia. That's the last bit that they want to lose. It's their strategic center of gravity. And because the Ukrainians have been signaling in that direction, and then about a month ago, they launched this Kherson offensive that's quite well covered in our media. The Russians rushed loads of troops down into Kherson, and they stripped them out from places like the Donbass, but also in Kharkiv, where we've seen this offensive. And so those thinned out Russian lines, basically the Ukrainians just punched through them and then had very, very fast mechanized forces. So infantry on fast vehicles that basically went behind through the Russian lines and then took out the logistics dumps that I've just spoken about. And that caused the Russian lines to collapse. So actually the Ukrainians didn't need to fight every last Russian soldier. They just collapsed their logistics and their command and control. And then in loads of places, the Russians just turned and ran away and abandoned all of their equipment.
Owen, in the wider scheme of things, what does this mean for the war? Because is it too optimistic to think that this is going to be in the last few months of the war? Will Russia, surrender?
Well, there's actually 2 different planes on which this war actually is being fought. One of them is actually the reality on the ground, which Mike's actually described very well and accurately. And then there's the public perception in Moscow. And frankly, there has been, a certain amount of bickering on various Kremlin TV talk shows and so on about who is to blame and so on. But in this grand scheme of things, the Kremlin has actually taken a really interesting line, and that is, that the war basically doesn't exist. So last week, Vladimir Putin gave a 40-minute, very boring speech on economics to the Vladivostok, Far Eastern Forum in Vladivostok. That in and of itself is important, that he actually decided the most important thing he could talk about was economics for 40 minutes and didn't mention war once. And he obliquely referred to sort of difficulties and new situations and so on. But also more importantly, not a single word about sort of patriotism. So I think actually it's very significant that the Kremlin actually has sort of decided to play this down enormously. And at the beginning, there's various rumors flare up from time to time that Putin needs to announce a full mobilization. And that's the only way he's going to win this war. But I'm sure, Mike is better qualified to talk than I am about this. But mobilization doesn't really help Putin on the ground. He doesn't really need more untrained people. Furthermore, as we know from various sort of military bloggers, a lot of the tactical battalions in every division so the training battalions in every division that are actually there to train up conscripts have actually been deployed to Ukraine. So there's actually no one to train the new people. But the bottom line is that actually in Moscow, in Russia, no one has noticed and no one cares. Now that's, and as we know, they've lost, last I heard from Zelensky was 6, Mike just said 9,000 square kilometers. We have to bear in mind that overall the Russians have taken about 120, depending on how you count it, but like they currently occupy about 21% just before the Kharkov front collapsed. And that's roughly speaking about 120, 130,000 square kilometers of territory. So in the grand scheme of things, they've maybe lost, 80% of that. And none of it was actually particularly ground that they were actually planning to keep. They were, I think, certainly planning to negotiate away their gains in Kharkov Oblast. What they really want is Donbass, and what they really want is the Mariupol corridor that links Crimea to Donbass. And the indications are that they were actually planning to negotiate away Kherson, but the Ukrainians may do that for them by taking it first.
So, Mike, still an uphill battle then for Ukraine from here?
Yeah, look, it's not going to end before winter, but I think it's definitely on the table that the war might end next summer. I remember coming on Spectator TV about 6 months ago, and you read out one of my tweets that said, I'm going to call this Ukraine's going to win it, and that will be followed by the end of Putin in Russia. And I still think that's the case. I think the fundamentals are that, the three most important things of warfare are strategy, logistics, and morale. And on all those three scores, Ukraine is doing much better and is in the ascendancy, and Russia is the opposite and is descending on those criteria. There are some key questions, right? At the moment, the rout of the Russian forces in the northeast, are they going to be able to stabilize that front line? They've tried to do it behind a river called the River Oskol. I think that's been breached in a couple of places. So that's a big question, where they stabilize the front line. And then the second question, the immediate question, is whether the Ukrainians have got a reserve with which they can sustain that attack. If not, I think nothing's going to happen before winter. Winter is going to be, naturally military activity dies down in winter, logistics are much more difficult, so on and so forth. And then we're looking at next spring, and assuming the Ukrainians are going to use the winter to train up, rearm, generate a reserve, then I expect to see another offensive from the Ukrainians. And, to date, they've been much more agile than the Russians have been on the battlefield. And that's been, one of the key advantages that they've had over the Russians.
Owen, I want to come to you very shortly about Putin's domestic situation. But before I do that, one question I always have when we're talking about the situation on the front line is how much we can believe what's coming out of the Ukrainian government. Because obviously, this is a side that the West is supporting. But we have seen that the government has bigged up, for obvious reasons, for morale reasons, its successors. So when reporting or when analysing the situation, how do you decipher what's to be relied on and what's not?
Well, the answer to that is pretty simple. You just follow the pro-Russian bloggers and people on Twitter. So there's actually, and very interestingly, there's actually several rebel commanders from the Donbass who have actually been very vocal. One of them is called Alexander Khodakovsky, not to be confused with Mikhail Khodorkovsky, and Igor Strelkov, and various sort of commanders on the ground. Or Strelkov is not on the ground, but he was former defense minister of the DNR. And they're constantly posting, I don't know where they get them, but constantly posting these drone footage and battlefield footage and, the head cam footage, because it's become, this is very much a sort of GoPro war. And also there's a lot of both official Russian correspondents on the ground and also various sort of wingnuts, including Graham Phillips, our very own British wingnut, who's out there, who is producing some, not incredibly reliable information, but certainly some interesting metrics on the ground about, what the soldiers are saying and so on. And the really interesting thing is that lots of the supposedly pro-Russian commanders in Donbass have actually just been saying, we were betrayed, we haven't got the logistics. There's actually a lot of discontent and anger. And one of the points about my article is that actually, these people who are currently, hand and fist with fighting on the ground with the Russian forces are actually, very scary people. There's a lot of very extreme right-wingers among them. There's lots of extreme nationalists among them. And right now, the fact that already they're speaking out, and Kremlin TV, state-sponsored TV correspondents are speaking out is actually quite significant. It means that things are really bad. So it doesn't really, necessarily confirm everything that the Ukrainians are saying, and I think the Ukrainians are actually slightly prone to exaggeration, especially if you look at the Ukrainian Defense Ministry official ticker. I think it's 49,700 or something was the last thing of Russian deaths on the ground. I mean, I suspect that's a little bit exaggerated, but nonetheless, I mean, what they're generally saying about a breakthrough is undoubtedly true.
Well, Owen, let's look at Putin's domestic situation then, because as you mentioned so far, he seems to have made some kind of coalition, an informal coalition with the ultra-nationalists. And actually, you write that it's these ultra-nationalists who could be causing him more headache now than the liberals like Alexei Navalny that we in the West know so much about.
Yeah, no, the liberals are not a headache. They're not even they're not even a sort of a vague thought in the minds of the Kremlin. They're absolutely not serious as an opposition, and certainly there is 0.0 chance that the liberal opposition will succeed Putin. That is literally not going to happen. I mean, and actually, for instance, the last time that Alexei Navalny, who's very often described on the BBC and so on as, the head of the Russian opposition, when Navalny last actually stood for public office as a local deputy in Moscow, he actually stood for mayor of Moscow, back in the early 2010s, in 2011, I think it was, he received 20%. Navalny got 20% of the vote in Moscow. So that gives you a sense of how electorally insignificant they are. Even in his power base, he gets 20%. No, so the much more scary thing, and it's not necessarily an electoral threat, but it's the fact that these people are armed, motivated, and highly angry, potentially at the Kremlin, and will become more so if there is battlefield defeat, are the ultra-nationalist paramilitaries. And what's really scary, and I think the point we really need to emphasize is the threat is not that these people are going to seize power. I mean, it's possible they might seize power. The Bolsheviks seized power with just a few thousand people in October 1917. So it's not they're going to seize power. It's what the Kremlin and the people around Putin are going to do to prevent them from becoming a threat. It's the vector in which the Kremlin has to go in order to appease these angry nationalist people. And that is the real threat. So Mike actually mentioned, Russia without Putin. And I think a lot of people, especially Western capitals, certainly Emmanuel Macron, I know for a fact because I've spoken to one of his advisors at some length about this, are actually rather scared about what Russia without Putin will look like. And equally, the direct extension of that is they're scared of giving Ukraine too many weapons and weapons that are too powerful. And just to give you a very precise idea of how few weapons Ukraine is getting, I'm not sure what the exact, certainly a few weeks ago they were operating with 24 HIMARS multiple rocket systems that launch high accuracy rockets. 24 is what the Americans gave the Ukrainians. In May, the Polish army ordered 500. So 500 HIMARS is what a medium-sized European army requires for its operational needs in peacetime, 500. The Ukrainians have been given 24 in wartime. So that really shows how incredibly limited the military support really has been. And the reason for that is because they're scared of actually inflicting a catastrophic battlefield defeat because they don't want to cause another Russian revolution. That's a real concern.
I mean, it's fascinating what you say about Macron's advisor telling you about this Weimar Republic comparison, because of course it was post-First World War Germany that led to Hitler. It's fascinating calculus going on here. Mike, what happens if Putin feels like he is being cornered on the battlefield? Because there is a lot of talk about possibly is this when he turns towards what's called a tactical nuclear attack. Could that happen?
So I think that there is a lot of talk about that. I think the thing about tactical nuclear weapons is there's no such thing, right? All nuclear weapons are strategic, and if your opponent loses and uses a nuclear weapon, you don't go, "Oh, it's just a small one, so that's fine." they're all nuclear weapons. For a long time now, since the Second World War, we collectively, you know, the Russians, the nuclear powers have operated under these norms of non-use of tactical, you got me doing it, of nuclear weapons. And we do that because of mutually assured destruction, right? If somebody uses them, then somebody else is gonna deliver a response. My reading of the situation is that Putin doesn't know if he uses a nuclear weapon, what the response will be. There's 3 nuclear powers working against him: France, Britain, and America. I'm sure there's a lot of conversations under the table that we're not aware of, but the use of a nuclear weapon on what is effectively European soil, I simply don't see how America, Britain, and France can allow that to stand. So I think the calculation in Putin's head will be, well, if I use a nuclear weapon, I can't be sure at all that I will survive that use of that nuclear weapon in terms of retaliation, or whether you know, bits of Russia will also not survive. And I think certainly he would be ejected from power, if not killed in some way. And I just think that that's his calculation. They are losing the war slowly, and it's hard to see how a nuclear weapon helps them win that war. And we haven't even seen the use of chemical weapons, for instance, which, you know, we saw Assad, you know, Russia's close ally in Syria, using that, and we haven't even seen any hint of that against Ukraine. So I don't think nuclear weapons are on the table. You asked really quickly what's he going to do with his back against the wall. I can answer that very, very briefly. I don't think there is much that he can do. I think he's boxed in. I don't really see how militarily he can recover the position and regain the initiative.
Well, I hope you're right, Mark. We're going to have to leave it there, but thank you so much for joining Spectator TV both.